Okay, guys, so welcome to our final session on the Odyssey of Homer before we move on to Oedipus the King. So I want to begin by how I usually begin, and that's by recalling what we had discussed earlier and situating today's lecture within the bigger picture of this course, right? So you might recall that we spoke about two aspects of the human condition, right? We said the first is that woman is a being who is capable of reflection, and in particular to ask questions such as, who am I? And ask questions with regards to what is reality as a whole, right? And that this is embodied in the where from dilemma, right? Where does man come from? Where does man come from here does not just refer to, the biological question, but the existential question in terms of our origins and whatnot. And we said that this reflection over one's origins and on reality and the desire to understand the truth of our world, right, also enables us to take conscious decisions and actions in relation to our future, the where from, right? What is it that I want to do, right? What is my endpoint? What is my objective and whatnot? Or to put it differently, the future, the question of the future. So the human subject, if we want to look at it now in this lecture, if we want to look at it more deeply, we can see it this way, okay? The human subject, right, let's say in this case, it is Odysseus. He is always in the present, right? Any human subject, when he is thinking about these questions, such as Odysseus or Gilgamesh, he is in the present, in his present. And one of the things that the subject, Odysseus, will reflect on, or Gilgamesh will reflect on, is his past, right? In asking the question, where from, or the question of reality, they reflect on their past. And they reflect on the fact that they were born into a world, and so they want to make sense of this world. And it's key when we emphasize that it is the fact that when you reflect on your past, that you were born into a world, and it's not a world of your own making. If it is a world that you had made, right, in the same way you build a house, there would be no sense of curiosity or anxiety. There would be no need to pursue a truth because the truth is already given to you. You produce it. So the one of the first things, right, is this Odysseus reflecting on the past and Gilgamesh reflecting on the past, trying to make sense of reality as a whole, right? And then this leads to the question of, okay, now what do I do in the future? In other words, what is my project? What is it that I aim to be, right? Both of these questions take place not in an abstract void or merely in literature, but they take place in the present, right? And what is really the objective ultimately of the subject of Odysseus and Gilgamesh in the present, right? In as they are uttering and reflecting, it is essentially, like Heidegger put it, who is an existentialist philosopher, it is to feel at home, right? To feel a sense of belonging, right? And thus, like we said, the Odyssey of Homer, the Odyssey is essentially a journey towards feeling at home, or becoming, right? Authentic and so forth. طيب. Now, clearly, right, we will see throughout these books that all of our heroes, all of our subjects, Gilgamesh, Odysseus, Oedipus, Augustine, Ghazali, Dante, will ask these two questions. What is different, however, is the answers that they give to these questions, right? And subsequently, they will each determine a different type of future, a different where to, right? So I want to stop at this briefly and talk about what is it that really shapes, what is it about reflection that shapes the way we project ourselves onto our future. Now, when you are reflecting on the future, on reality, when you are trying to understand your origins, you are trying to think about what is the structure of reality, right? For example, before you choose your major in AUB, right, what do? You reflect on your society, you reflect on your relationships, you reflect on your own interests, and you begin to think about, for example, what job opportunities or what is the importance of this field in society, right? How does it relate to wealth, capital? How does it relate to stability? How does it relate to those who are in power, and so forth? So you reflect on the existing structure of society, and based on that, you determine what your major is. So your major, right, and graduation represents the where to. The decision to take each course is the actions that you consciously partake in to reach that where to, that future. And reflection is the process through which you deliberate what type of major should I invest in. And this is not done purely through self-interest, but it is also done on a reflection about the type of society that you live in and the relations within that society. Now, when we think about the where to in more existential terms, such as where to, i.e., what is my purpose in life, similarly, we find that our heroes in this text are reflecting on the structure of reality, on the structure of the world, right? In particular, what is the place of man in the cosmos, right? What is the relationship between man and history, man and fate, or man and the gods, right? The way these questions are answered essentially determine, right, how we project ourselves onto the future. So in the case of Gilgamesh, right, it is a very nice and clear example of how a reflection on the cosmos or on reality shapes his future, shapes his project. So Gilgamesh, upon hearing Enkidu's last words, comes to realize that he lives in an impersonal world, right? And a world wherein there is no defined higher meaning. In other words, there is no God that defined meaning for man and made this meaning transparent, right? Rather, you had gods, and then you had a sense of nothingness after death, or what, Enkidu told us is the house of dust, right? Now, in the absence of a higher meaning, we found that Gilgamesh had to pursue one of two trajectories. Either change his being and try to become immortal, or establish and cultivate his own meaning and thus his own purpose, right? And this is something which constantly comes up in history and in philosophy, this idea of man as being responsible for his future and determining the meaning of his or her own life, and like we find in the works of Friedrich Nietzsche and so forth. Now, in contrast, we will find, for example, St. Augustine, who upon reflecting comes to the realization that there is, for example, a benevolent God, right? I always say that wrong, benevolent God. And that this God has established a purpose for man, and that the relationship between man and the ideal is his fallen state and his original sin. Therefore, purpose is defined. The future of what ought to be, the where to, is defined essentially as redemption, right? Redemption through Christ, and the medium being the church, and so forth. Now, one of the things that we as students in the 21st century need to keep in mind is that, of course, each of these texts provides different insights into the where to, where from question, where from, where to question, and our judgment and the way we assess them should not be based, of course, on which makes us feel good or which suits our self-interest. It is essentially a question of what is strongest in the face of and most valid in the face of critical scrutiny and so forth. So when we speak of St. Augustine as saying, there is a higher purpose, that does not immediately mean that St. Augustine is correct, right? This is the point of the course, is not to determine who is correct and who is not. It is merely to give you an array of existential prospects that each of our heroes embodied and exemplified. So now let's go back to Odysseus. Okay, so the type of world that Odysseus, the cosmos that Odysseus occupies, is a world where you have the immortal gods and you have the mortal beings, right? Odysseus being mortal. Mortal as in there is the finality of death, right? And we said that there is no holistic order because there are multiple gods who have human-like attributes and arbitrary dispositions and feelings, and that these gods often conflict with one another. And so what this means is that, one, there is no higher meaning, so to speak, and two, that and a second source of anxiety, in addition to the absence of a higher meaning, is that fate and our actions and the outcomes of our decisions are not always predictable in the same way we take our actions to be predictable, right, and safe. This is something that we take for granted. We take cause and effect for granted, right? We take it for granted that, for example, with Augustine, that God is just, or that the higher powers will do what is best for the betterment of mankind and so forth. For Odysseus, this is not the case. So it's very similar to, for example, if you knew, let's say, that a particular instructor, that no matter how good you do, the way he grades you will be based on whether or not he had a good or bad day. So imagine the type of anxiety that would create, right? Because your outcome, your prospects are no longer defined by your actions, but they are determined by something that is arbitrary. So naturally, this creates a type of anxiety that we find in Greek literature, right? Again, the absence of a holistic order, and two, the arbitrariness of fate and the actions of the gods. So what does this mean for Odysseus? It means two things. First, that the future, his where to, is essentially something that he must define for himself. And the second is the importance of choice, the importance of deliberating and taking the right choices, because he must take into account not only his own internal limitations, right, but also the possible outcomes and the possible external obstacles that will come out, as we found, for example, with Poseidon when he decided to punish Odysseus because the gods had not sought out his opinion in allowing Odysseus to go back to Ithaca. One second. Okay, resume recording. Sorry, I had paused it. So this now gives us a nice segue into book 5, right? So in book 5, right, we find all of the gods meeting on Mount Olympus to discuss Odysseus' fate, right? And they had agreed that Odysseus should be allowed to leave Calypso's island, right, and return back to Ithaca. Now, the problem was that Poseidon was not there at the meeting, right? And so we already talked about Calypso helping him leave. Anyway, so as Odysseus is leaving, right, he begins his journey. 18 days into it, right, Poseidon finds out, the god of the sea, right, that Odysseus has essentially left for Ithaca, and that Poseidon was not consulted in this. So what does Poseidon try to do? He tries to sabotage the trip, right? And then so he sets out the storm, and it nearly drags Odysseus and drowns Odysseus, had it not been for the intervention of the gods. So this is significant. So his potential demise was the result of a divine intervention, and he was saved through similarly divine intervention, right? And despite that, we find that one of the characteristics that Homer is trying to bring out in Odysseus is that he weighs every decision that he takes. So, for example, in book 5 and in book 6, we have when he is trying to decide whether to land on, the rocky part of the island of Scheria, or to land by the river, to seek shelter in the woods, or and how to embrace and how to approach Nausicaa, right, the princess, and so forth. So we find that there's this very cunning and deliberative mind of Odysseus, right, where everything is calculated and every choice is chosen, right? And this is not only because as some interpreters say that, because he was a general, and in war that you need to be strategic and so forth. That's certainly part of it, right? But it also tells us about the type of world and the type of things that Odysseus had to take into consideration when pursuing his Odyssey, right? In the face of unpredictability, and in the face of arbitrariness, and in the face of these internal and external obstacles, we find that Odysseus has to be deliberative, and this is precisely one of the reasons that he is perceived to be a hero. And here we also have a very nice introduction into the maturing of Greek thought, right? That the hero is not just a hero by virtue of his physical strength, in battle, but also by his intellect, right? A hero is also heroic by virtue of his intellect, and not just, his Superman-like abilities and so forth. So kind of like this odd hero, or maybe a bit like the anti-hero that we find in modern literature, and so forth. Now, in book 6, again, the gods intervene. Athena intervenes and appears in a dream to the princess Nokisa, right? And basically tells her, listen, go to the shore uh, uh, with your handmaidens and wash your clothes so that basically you are naked, and this will help you appear more beautiful or uh, beautiful, fetching, when it comes to the suitors and so forth. So she does so. And of course, what Athena has in mind is for her to come across who? Odysseus. So again, we are given this image of a shipwrecked Odysseus, who, much like his state on the mount, uh, uh, with Calypso, is essentially nude and on the shore. And he is approached and assisted by a young woman, not by a king or not by a oracle or a priest or a priestess. He is approached by a young princess, right? So this again also tells us something, right? In the beginning, he was really under the mercy of Calypso, a female goddess, and here he is under the mercy, so to speak, of Nokisa, who is a young princess, right? So this also tells us something about the irony of fate and Greek life as a tragedy, right? Um, uh, Again, keeping in mind that Odysseus is the same Odysseus of the Trojan War. And so, of course, Nokisa gives him these instructions, like you read in the text, to go out to the palace, to approach Arete, who is the queen, and essentially that Arete will extend hospitality and take him in, right? Now, what turns out to be a very interesting twist here is that the people of the Phaeacians, right, and the princess and the king and the queen are actually committed, or they are Odysseus finds them celebrating Poseidon, making sacrifices for Poseidon. So this is kind of like a twist, right? It creates this sense of suspense, because we know that Poseidon had set out to sabotage Odysseus' trip. And another interesting thing for you to consider, especially in your reflections, is that Odysseus has to conceal his true identity, right? Now, we can stop at that point and ask, why and what exactly is the place of the ethical considerations, moral considerations throughout the Odyssey of Homer, right? Why is it that on the one hand, there is expectation for them to extend hospitality to Odysseus, but at the same time, Odysseus is concealing his identity, right? This is something worth reflecting on and thinking about. And in what ways is morality and ethics, predefined by the type of world that Homer is writing about, that Odysseus, um, lives in, right? This world of the gods and the arbitrariness of fate, and of course the fundamental problem with relation to free will and determinism, the extent to which we have free will and are able to really define our own futures. So in the second part of this lecture, I will go through books final readings, which is Odysseus' reflections on his journey, right? So if you've read up until book 7, I believe book 9, you will know that eventually Odysseus confesses to being the great commander and the leader of the Trojan War, and he tells them about his journey. So here we kind of go back in time and we look at Odysseus's journey, what basically led him to being shipwrecked and ending up on Calypso's island. And what is important about this is that it illustrates to us the limitations. Homer also brings to fore the limitations of man. So up until now, we've been looking at the external obstacles that obstruct one's realization of the where-to, the future, one's authenticity. Odysseus' reflections about his journey that ended up on Calypso's island reveals something else. It reveals our own internal limitations and the internal obstacles that curtail our ability to reach true authenticity. And we will see several examples of this in the coming talk, inshallah.